We were so overwhelmed by the challenges of shooting that one of our stars refused to come out of his dressing room. It seems hard for me to believe so much went wrong.
Steven Spielberg regrets a lot of things, but there's one film he openly calls his creative heartbreak. A movie that didn't just disappoint him, it scarred him.
I should never have messed with the archive of my own work. I don't recommend anybody really do that. We may not agree on everything. We may all agree on a comedy. And I thought it really did put us back on the map.
And it wasn't about box office numbers or bad reviews. This was deeper, personal, psychological. It changed how he approached filmmaking forever. What began as a childhood fantasy brought to life slowly turned into a production nightmare, haunted by clashing egos, emotional blowouts, and a co-star so difficult that Spielberg says he just couldn't work with her. But this wasn't just another difficult production. It was the moment Steven Spielberg learned that some creative wounds never heal. The director who never looks back. Steven Spielberg regrets making Hook. Not mildly, not in passing, but in a way that still lingers, like a scar he tries not to touch. And to understand just how deep that regret runs, you have to look at something Spielberg almost never does. He doesn't re-watch his own movies. Not E.T., not Jaws, not Jurassic Park. For most directors, that sounds odd. But for Spielberg, it's almost a rule. He once said watching his older work makes him feel like a different person entirely. Like he's watching someone else's footage. Someone younger. Someone who didn't yet know how to direct the way he does now. It's not about shame or pride. It's about distance. Emotional distance. Spielberg believes once a film is finished, it belongs to the audience, not him. So, he moves on. But with Hook, that separation never really came. Because this time, he didn't just dislike the final product. He blamed himself for it. And even more painfully, he didn't feel like he could escape it. During a 2011 interview, Spielberg admitted that he had no confidence in the making of Hook. Think about that. This is the guy who redefined modern cinema. And here he is, decades later, calling one of his own films a creative failure he never quite recovered from. It's not that the movie flopped. In fact, it made over $300 million at the global box office. But in Spielberg's eyes, success didn't matter. Because Hook had exposed something raw, his uncertainty as a storyteller when the magic fades. Now, what's fascinating is that Hook is one of the only Spielberg films he has ever openly said he would go back and change. He leaves most of his films alone, even those with production issues or complicated histories. But Hook, that one haunts him. He once confessed, "I still don't like that movie. I'm hoping someday I'll see it again, and maybe like some of it." And that statement? That wasn't a press-friendly shrug. That was a real admission of regret. Because it wasn't just the story, or the design, or even the pacing that got under his skin. It was something deeper. Spielberg felt like he lost control, that his vision slipped out of his hands and got twisted in the process. Here's the psychological twist. When artists avoid their own work, it's often not about disliking the product. It's about protecting the memory of what it could have been, about shielding themselves from the discomfort of watching an unfinished dream wobble across the screen. Spielberg wasn't just dodging a bad movie. He was avoiding a very specific moment in his career. A moment when his belief in himself faltered. When the world's most iconic director felt like an imposter on his own set. He said the production of Hook felt like he was making this movie without a compass. And that phrase? That's heavy coming from a man who had navigated Close Encounters, Raiders, and Schindler's List with a kind of cinematic GPS most directors only dream of. But in 1991, during Hook, he felt lost. Now compare that to someone like Quentin Tarantino, who practically celebrates his filmography like a trophy case, or James Cameron, who openly revisits and remasters his older movies with meticulous precision. Spielberg isn't like that. He doesn't throw anniversaries for his classics or do director's cuts to redeem his misfires. And maybe that's what makes Hook sting even more. Because it broke through that personal boundary, it's one of the few projects that didn't just disappoint him, it embarrassed him. Some of you might be thinking, was it really that bad? And to be fair, Hook has plenty of fans. Nostalgia definitely plays a role. Kids who saw it in the early 90s remember Robin Williams flying, John Williams's gorgeous score, and the candy-colored Neverland with Peter Pan vibes turned up to 11. But if you look closer, Spielberg wasn't making Hook for those kids. He was trying to make a movie for himself, a grown-up dealing with the fear of becoming ordinary, a father wrestling with how to connect with his children. It was personal. And when it all fell apart on set, when the tone became confused, the visuals over-designed, and the performances clashed, Spielberg felt like he'd exposed something vulnerable. And maybe that's why he doesn't just walk away from Hook like he does the rest. He looks away, even decades later. Now, here's something to chew on. What does it say about an artist when they reject their own work this completely? Is it humility, perfectionism, or is it something more existential, like watching your own handwriting and not recognizing it anymore? What do you think? Which other directors famously hated their own films? You'd be surprised how many creators quietly distance themselves from their biggest hits. Coppola, Kubrick, and even David Fincher have their regrets. But Spielberg's case, it hits different. Because this wasn't just a critique of a movie, it was a public confession of personal failure. And yet, here's where the rabbit hole deepens. Because Hook wasn't doomed from the start, it had Robin Williams, Dustin Hoffman, a John Williams score, and Spielberg's name on the poster. It had the tools, it had the money, it even had the audience. So, what exactly pushed Hook across the line from creative misfire to personal trauma? That's where she comes in. Because, as chaotic as production was, there was one relationship, one presence on set that Spielberg later admitted nearly broke him. And that's when this story stops being about a movie and starts being about trust, betrayal, and a creative partnership that collapsed right in front of the camera. The $80 million disaster that nobody saw coming. So how does a Spielberg movie, a Peter Pan movie no less, go from childhood dream to behind-the-scenes nightmare? The original plan for Hook was modest, intimate even. Spielberg imagined a small, character-driven story about a grown-up Peter Pan returning to Neverland. The budget was supposed to hover around $48 million, which, for the early 1990s, was already pushing it. But this was Spielberg in his prime. After E.T. and Indiana Jones, studios were ready to write him a blank check. And that check just kept getting bigger. By the time the final credits rolled, Hook had ballooned to a staggering $80 million. In today's numbers, that's well over $170 million. And that's not even counting marketing. At the time, it was one of the most expensive films ever made. Yet, very few people on set felt like they were making something that matched the cost. The sets were enormous, but something about the heart of the movie felt lost. Part of the reason was the shift in tone. Originally, Hook was meant to be darker, more grounded. Spielberg wanted it to feel like Peter Pan meets a midlife crisis. But somewhere in the studio notes, the rewrites, and the massive soundstage builds, that vision blurred. Suddenly, Neverland wasn't a shadowy memory. It was a day-glow theme park. Full-sized pirate ships, oversized food fights, and a Lost Boys hideout that looked more like a cartoon playground than a dreamscape. One insider described it like this: "It felt like we were building a Disneyland attraction, not shooting a movie." Then came the casting shift. Early drafts had Peter Pan as a man emotionally stuck between adulthood and childhood. But with Robin Williams cast, everything changed. Spielberg adored him, but Robin was energy incarnate. Hilarious, uncontainable. So, the film bent around him. Jokes got bigger, scenes got broader. The emotional through line is scattered. And it wasn't just Robin who brought chaos. Dustin Hoffman, as Captain Hook, was famously demanding, insisting on countless takes, obsessing over wardrobe and line delivery. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Because then there was her, Julia Roberts. Fresh off Pretty Woman, Roberts was cast as Tinker Bell, a studio-approved move. A guaranteed way to bring in a younger audience. But on set, things took a strange turn. According to multiple reports, she isolated herself, clashed with production, and became a source of constant tension. Spielberg himself later admitted she was difficult to work with. And for Spielberg to say that publicly, that's rare. He's loyal, protective. But when asked directly about Julia's behavior, he didn't deflect. He said she was going through a lot, referencing her engagement breakdown, but still called the experience complicated. Behind the scenes, she was reportedly nicknamed Tinker Hell. And it wasn't just tabloid drama. Roberts often shot solo on a green screen due to the scale differences between her and the other actors. That meant no chemistry, no real-time reactions, and growing frustration. She even briefly left the set, sparking rumors she might quit entirely. All this chaos fed a deeper problem. Nobody agreed on what kind of movie they were making. Was it a fairy tale? A psychological drama? A children's comedy? Some scenes were emotionally gutting, others were slapstick chaos. Spielberg later said that he didn't have faith in the script, that he felt like a fish out of water. And this is the same director who made Jaws work without showing the shark. But here, surrounded by massive sets, clashing tones, and celebrity egos, he felt paralyzed. Production ran weeks behind. Scenes were rewritten on the fly. Sets were built before final drafts were done. The movie felt improvised at the scale of a small country. And then, there's the money. Set construction alone reportedly ate up over a quarter of it. But the real cost wasn't the budget. It was the toll on Spielberg himself. This wasn't just another studio film. Hook was personal. Spielberg once called Peter Pan one of the most important mythologies of my childhood. And now, he couldn't even bring himself to watch it, because the real cost was something far more valuable. But what happens when the man who made movie magic out of a broken shark finds his leading lady emotionally unraveling? And worse, what if he can't save her this time? When America's Sweetheart became Tinker Hell. It was supposed to be the perfect fairy tale comeback. Robin Williams as Peter Pan, Dustin Hoffman as a larger-than-life Captain Hook, and Julia Roberts, the biggest movie star of the early 90s, as the mischievous, magical Tinker Bell. But behind the pixie dust, Hook was falling apart, and Spielberg knew exactly why. By the time cameras rolled in 1991, Julia Roberts had cemented herself as America's sweetheart. Pretty Woman had made her a box office gold. But while her career soared, her personal life unraveled. Weeks before filming, her engagement to Kiefer Sutherland imploded, reportedly because he cheated with a stripper. She called off the wedding 3 days before it happened, then fled to Ireland with his best friend, Jason Patric. Tabloids exploded, and Spielberg was left holding together a $70 million movie with a lead actress in emotional freefall. The Julia who showed up on set wasn't the radiant, giggling star fans knew. The crew described her as tense, distant, and at times unapproachable. She battled insomnia, spent hours isolated in her trailer, and insiders said she broke down crying more than once. Soon, people stopped calling her Julia. They called her Tinkerhell. And that nickname didn't come from tabloids. It came from the set. Lighting techs whispered it. Costume assistants swapped stories. Even cast members used it quietly. It was cruel, yes, but it reflected the tension that had gripped the production. One crew member claimed Roberts refused to leave her trailer unless the lighting was changed to make her look more magical. Another recalled Spielberg reshooting entire scenes because Roberts challenged his direction. The wings, digitally altered in post because she hated the harness. Spielberg, who had steered Jaws, E.T., and Raiders, now faced a problem no special effects could solve: emotional volatility. In later interviews, he avoided details. When asked about filming Hook, he paused and said only, "It wasn't a good experience." The silence said the rest. And when asked if he'd work with Roberts again, just one word: no. He didn't just say it. He looked away. That's when fans knew this wasn't just clashing personalities. It broke something in Spielberg. Hook was meant to be a love letter to childhood wonder. But the stress, emotional drain, and constant tension with Roberts turned it into a professional regret. Not because of box office performance, but because of what it cost him personally. You could track Spielberg's disillusionment scene by scene. Early on, there was optimism. Roberts had a cottage-shaped trailer, the sets looked magical, and the studio had high hopes. But as filming dragged, the mood soured. Spielberg leaned on assistant directors, stopped table reads, and reportedly started arriving late, something he'd never done. Publicly, they kept up appearances. Julia later told Oprah that working with Spielberg was not so bad, a faint endorsement that said more in what it left out. Spielberg didn't mince words. "Julia probably wasn't in the best state of mind to work," he said. "That's director speak for 'she made my life hell.'" But Roberts wasn't just a cold diva. She was under immense pressure, recovering from a public betrayal, and expected to sparkle. She finished the film. But the toll, especially on Spielberg, was something no one forgot. And Spielberg? He walked away not just disappointed, but wounded. He never made a fantasy like Hook again. But something deeper was unraveling, something Spielberg never said out loud. As the cameras rolled, his dream project was slipping into something unrecognizable. So, what really changed behind the curtain, and who made that call? The secrets Hollywood tried to bury. But what happened behind the scenes of Hook didn't just challenge Spielberg's patience, it rattled his creative core. Because once you start peeling back the layers, you realize this wasn't just a chaotic shoot. It was a full-blown identity crisis, masked as a children's fantasy film. And yes, it begins with Tinkerbell. Long before Julia Roberts flitted on screen in that glittery green dress, there was another name locked in for the role: Rebecca De Mornay. And if you were around in the 1980s, you know she wasn't just another starlet. She was the face of edgy, intelligent rebellion, a presence that could go toe-to-toe with the best of them. According to crew leaks and casting logs, De Mornay had actually been Spielberg's first choice for Tinkerbell, not just for her acting chops, but because of the raw, unpredictable energy she could bring to a role that was originally much darker and more emotionally complex. But then, almost overnight, she was out. No official reason, no press release, just gone. Some insiders say her relationship with Tom Cruise which had just ended, put the studio on edge. Others point to scheduling conflicts. But the theory that never quite died? Julia Roberts wanted the part badly. And by then, Roberts wasn't just America's sweetheart. She was box office gravity. Spielberg reportedly gave in to pressure, despite harboring early doubts. And sure enough, the on-set relationship between them turned toxic fast. She showed up late. She left early. She allegedly locked herself in trailers, clashed with makeup artists, and even flew off mid-production for personal emergencies. Spielberg started calling her Tinker Hell. Years later, when asked if he'd ever work with her again, his answer was cold. Never. But the casting shuffle wasn't the only emergency. There was a deeper issue: the script. Spielberg had inherited a screenplay that was part fairy tale, part Broadway-style musical, and part Peter Pan sequel, and entirely incoherent. Years later, he even admitted that he never quite knew who the movie was for. So the studio brought in someone Hollywood used as a secret weapon when stories were in free fall: Carrie Fisher. Yes, Princess Leia was a ghostwriter. Fisher had built a second career fixing broken screenplays in absolute silence. Uncredited, uncelebrated, but widely respected. Hook was one of her many emergency gigs. She was called in during production to rewrite large chunks of the dialogue, especially for Tinkerbell and Wendy, and to bring cohesion to the emotional core. But her script doctoring wasn't just technical polish. Fisher rewrote entire character arcs to make the film feel grounded in trauma, not just fantasy. She tried to turn Neverland into a psychological battleground between childhood nostalgia and adult grief, which would have been an incredible concept had anyone actually listened. But the film wasn't ready for that. The studio wanted spectacle, and spectacle is what they got, at the expense of tone, pace, and cohesion. And if you think that was the strangest behind-the-scenes rewrite, buckle in. Because here's something Spielberg never talks about in interviews, but Bob Hoskins did. During a candid chat with the press years later, Hoskins casually revealed that he and Dustin Hoffman, who played Mr. Smee and Captain Hook, made a quiet, deliberate decision. They were going to play their characters as a gay couple, not flamboyantly, not for laughs, just with intimacy, soft touches, long glances, and shared lines that felt like inside jokes between old lovers. If you rewatch Hook today with that lens, it's shockingly obvious and strangely tender. Hoskins said they did it to give their roles depth because the script gave them so little. Spielberg reportedly didn't notice or chose not to address it, but it added a layer to the film that no one saw coming. And once you know it's there, you can't unsee it. That quiet subtext, the deleted trauma arcs, the recasting politics, all of it speaks to a movie that was constantly battling itself. It wanted to be profound but was forced to be loud. It wanted to explore the death of imagination but got trapped in plastic pirate ships and cotton candy sets. Even the logistics were a nightmare. Hook went nearly 40 days over schedule, partly because of elaborate sets, but also because of child labor laws. Spielberg refused to cast older teens as the Lost Boys. He wanted real kids, which meant short filming hours, frequent breaks, and expensive reshoots when lines were flubbed. That choice alone extended production by months. And we haven't even talked about the deleted scenes, which are legendary among die-hard fans. There was an entire subplot where Peter's son, Jack, nearly becomes Hook's protege in battle. Gone. A scene where Wendy's daughter has a cryptic vision of Neverland as an adult. Gone. And yes, there was reportedly a darker version of Tinkerbell's farewell, where she fades away slowly, alone, after Peter chooses mortality. Spielberg allegedly cut it because test audiences found it too sad. But Carrie Fisher fought to keep it in, claiming it was the emotional closure the story needed. She lost, and the result? A movie that looked like a blockbuster but felt like a beautiful, broken collage. And Spielberg? He never made another film like it. Not just because it underperformed, but because Hook left a wound. A deeply personal, creative wound. And that nickname didn't come from tabloids. It came from the set. Lighting techs whispered it. Costume assistants swapped stories. Even cast members used it quietly. It was cruel, yes, but it reflected the tension that had gripped the production. One crew member claimed Roberts refused to leave her trailer unless the lighting was changed to make her look more magical. Another recalled Spielberg reshooting entire scenes because Roberts challenged his direction. The wings, digitally altered in post because she hated the harness. Spielberg, who had steered Jaws, E.T., and Raiders, now faced a problem no special effects could solve: emotional volatility. In later interviews, he avoided details. When asked about filming Hook, he paused and said only, "It wasn't a good experience." The silence said the rest. And when asked if he'd work with Roberts again, just one word: no. He didn't just say it. He looked away. That's when fans knew this wasn't just clashing personalities. It broke something in Spielberg. Hook was meant to be a love letter to childhood wonder. But the stress, emotional drain, and constant tension with Roberts turned it into a professional regret. Not because of box office performance, but because of what it cost him personally. You could track Spielberg's disillusionment scene by scene. Early on, there was optimism. Roberts had a cottage-shaped trailer, the sets looked magical, and the studio had high hopes. But as filming dragged, the mood soured. Spielberg leaned on assistant directors, stopped table reads, and reportedly started arriving late, something he'd never done. Publicly, they kept up appearances. Julia later told Oprah that working with Spielberg was not so bad, a faint endorsement that said more in what it left out. Spielberg didn't mince words. "Julia probably wasn't in the best state of mind to work," he said. "That's director speak for, she made my life hell." But Roberts wasn't just a cold diva. She was under immense pressure, recovering from a public betrayal, and expected to sparkle. She finished the film. But the toll, especially on Spielberg, was something no one forgot. And Spielberg? He walked away not just disappointed, but wounded. He never made a fantasy like Hook again. But something deeper was unraveling, something Spielberg never said out loud. As the cameras rolled, his dream project was slipping into something unrecognizable. So, what really changed behind the curtain, and who made that call? The secrets Hollywood tried to bury. But what happened behind the scenes of Hook didn't just challenge Spielberg's patience, it rattled his creative core. Because once you start peeling back the layers, you realize this wasn't just a chaotic shoot. It was a full-blown identity crisis, masked as a children's fantasy film. And yes, it begins with Tinker Bell. Long before Julia Roberts flitted on screen in that glittery green dress, there was another name locked in for the role: Rebecca De Mornay. And if you were around in the 1980s, you know she wasn't just another starlet. She was the face of edgy, intelligent rebellion, a presence that could go toe-to-toe with the best of them. According to crew leaks and casting logs, De Mornay had actually been Spielberg's first choice for Tinker Bell, not just for her acting chops, but because of the raw, unpredictable energy she could bring to a role that was originally much darker and more emotionally complex. But then, almost overnight, she was out. No official reason, no press release, just gone. Some insiders say her relationship with Tom Cruise, which had just ended, put the studio on edge. Others point to scheduling conflicts. But the theory that never quite died? Julia Roberts wanted the part badly. And by then, Roberts wasn't just America's sweetheart. She was box office gravity. Spielberg reportedly gave in to pressure, despite harboring early doubts. And sure enough, the on-set relationship between them turned toxic fast. Today, Hook has a cult following that spans generations. People quote it. People dress up as Rufio. TikTok dissects Wendy's monologue, and Robin Williams' performance as a grown-up Peter Pan is now seen as one of his most soulful roles, balancing whimsy with that aching adult sorrow only he could deliver. The Lost Boys? Still iconic. The pirate sets? Straight from a child's dreamscape. And John Williams' score? It lives rent-free in people's nostalgia playlists. But here's the twist. Spielberg still can't stand it. He's admitted it publicly, saying he didn't have confidence during filming, that he didn't know what the story was, and that he wasn't in love with the script. To him, Hook was a production plagued by distractions, from studio interference to the emotional turbulence of losing control over the narrative. And there's that painful detail from earlier, Julia Roberts. Her alleged clashes with the crew, her tension with Spielberg, and the tabloid pressure that spiraled during her role as Tinkerbell. It all seems to have left a bitter aftertaste that she's never really shaken off. And yet, here's the gut punch. The more he tries to distance himself, the more the audience embraces it. In the past few years alone, critics have begun revisiting Hook with fresh eyes. Not through the lens of box office receipts or critical expectations of the early 90s, but through the deeper emotional terrain it explored. The loneliness of adulthood, the loss of childhood wonder, and the pressure to be present in a world that demands productivity. Suddenly, those awkward tonal shifts and sprawling sets feel less like missteps and more like reflections of Peter Banning's internal chaos. And maybe that's what Spielberg missed, not technically, but emotionally. He saw a messy shoot. The audience saw their childhood slipping away, and a film brave enough to admit that growing up hurts. It's a strange kind of punishment for a perfectionist. He made a film he didn't believe in, and it became a movie people can't stop believing in. Imagine being Steven Spielberg, arguably the greatest living director, and the film you regret most is the one your fans treat like a bedtime story they never outgrew. That gap between creator intent and audience reception is where Hook now lives. And it's where Spielberg's discomfort festers. He wasn't proud of how it came together. But for millions, it did come together. Just not in the way he expected. Some directors get to bury their regrets. Spielberg, his regret is beloved. His regret is stitched into Robin Williams' legacy, into playground sword fights and bangarang chants, into those quiet, late-night rewatches where you realize the boy who never grew up turned into every overworked parent you've ever known. That's why this regret lingers, not because Hook failed, but because it didn't. Because it became something bigger than the man who made it. Something emotionally true, even if Spielberg couldn't see it through the fog of production chaos and press drama. And maybe, just maybe, that's the curse of creating something too personal during the wrong moment in your life. Spielberg wanted to escape that movie, but the world wouldn't let him. They loved what nearly broke him. So, what do you think? Should Spielberg ever revisit Hook? Should he watch it again, not as the director crushed by deadlines and studio demands, but as the viewer, sitting in a dark room, popcorn in hand, finally seeing the film for what it became. Because sometimes in Hollywood, the wounds that never heal are the ones that create the most lasting art, whether the artist wants to admit it or not. Should Spielberg give Hook a second chance? Or is it better off as the beloved misfire he'll never claim?